Hey guys, welcome to Remnant Radio. My name is Michael Rowntree. Joshua Lewis is out today on a cruise and joining with his wife, but we are going to have fun. Got Michael Miller joining me in the co-host seat today,
What's
and we
up?
are talking about transhumanism. Designer babies and robot people, and what does that do to the image of God, and all the exciting topics. So excited to interview Dr. Fazale in just a moment. Fazale Rana is his name. And so we'll be back with you. You guys stay tuned.
You are watching The Remnant Radio, a crowd-funded show where we interview pastors, teachers, historians, and theologians from different churches and denominations. My name is Joshua Lewis, and this is my co-host, Michael Rowntree. Together, we want to help you break outside of your theological echo chambers. If you're interested in learning about history, theology, or the gifts of the Spirit, this is the show for you.
Okay, guys, here we are talking transhumanism. Super excited. Hey, before we dive in, just want you guys to know the Remnant Radio is crowd-funded. And so if you are blessed by our content, then love for you guys to consider donating. You can see it in the links of the description. You can do a one-time donation through PayPal or a recurring one through Patreon. You have access to exclusive content there. So I hope you guys will check that out. And also help us out by liking, commenting, and hitting that subscribe button too. Now, without further ado, Michael Miller over there in Denver, thank you for joining us for an interview format. Used to having you on the Wednesday show, but it's fun to have you on the Monday show too. So, how are you doing over there in Denver?
Good, bro. I'll just be the eye candy for this episode. Nothing really to contribute.
It's all you
nothing
ever are,
intellectual.
Michael.
Yeah, just some eye candy for you.
Well, we just actually want to see your hair. Somebody was commenting. Does Miller actually does he have hair? Is he covering something? I said, well, he actually has a nickname.
Tell you what.
His nickname is Hats. I can't get used to it because that nickname arose after my day. But after we were when we were at the same church together, we called you Michael, but then people started calling you Hats.
Well, yeah. So I'll make you a deal. Anybody who shows up to the Remnant Radio conference will actually get to see me not wear a hat. How's that?
Okay.
We'll see if there's anything there. If I have any hair or not.
I think that's a good deal. So make sure you guys sign up for that conference. And so March 2nd through the 4th, going to be super exciting. Remnant Radio having our first conference. But okay, we want to dive into this subject. Transhumanism intersects on so many different things. Intersects on obviously theology, but besides theology, there's technology, there's philosophy, there's ethics. There's so many big questions to consider. And of course, some of you are listening. You're like, I don't know what transhumanism even is. So we're gonna talk about that too. But I want you to meet our guest, Dr. Fazale Rana, is an expert on this subject, and he is the CEO at Reasons to Believe. Has written a lot of books, and he's really, really smart. So you guys are gonna be blessed. And Dr. Fazale Rana has told us not to call him Dr. Rana, and his first name, Fazale, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. You can correct me, because what I really know is your nickname, which is Fuzz. He goes by Fuzz. So we're going to call him Fuzz for the rest of the show. But Fuzz, tell us just a little bit about yourself, and also maybe just books you're writing or that you've written that people can connect with you and your ministry through.
Yeah, well, I've been with Reasons to Believe for 23 years, and it's an organization that explores the interaction between science and the Christian faith. We are a scientific apologetics organization, but we really see ourselves as developing apologetics material in service of evangelism. So we see our mission is to open people to the gospel by revealing God in science. And I'm a biochemist by training and have written a number of books on the origin of life, on the design of biochemical systems, also work in synthetic biology where scientists are trying to create new novel life forms in the laboratory. Also very interested in the question of human origins, and that is really what led me to the whole question of transhumanism. A couple of years ago, had a book published called Humans 2.0, where we look at the question of transhumanism from a Christian perspective, really asking the question, how should we as Christians engage this particular topic. And it's no easy measure. It's a very complex interplay of a number of different areas, as you pointed out, Michael. And if people are interested in our organization, they can go to our website, www.reasons.org, and learn more about our what we're about and the resources that we have to help people connect science with the Christian faith.
Okay, wonderful. Well, why don't we just dive in then with the question of what is transhumanism? Because a lot of our people don't even know precisely what that is. So could you give us just a definition and talk to us about the different areas of theology even that this touches on?
Yeah, well, if people who are watching this or listening to this aren't familiar with the term transhumanism, join the club, because I find most people are unfamiliar with the term, but you actually are probably very familiar with the concepts of transhumanism. Transhumanism, in a nutshell, is this idea that we as human beings have a moral imperative to use technology to modify our biological makeup, to use technology to make us stronger and smarter and more psychologically well adjusted, to use technology to overcome the flaws of the human body, to overcome our limitations as human beings. And the hope is that in doing so, we will mitigate pain and suffering, and that we will maybe even pave a pathway to a type of utopia. Now, this idea of transhumanism has been around since the turn of the last century. Probably the first scientist to articulate what we might call the transhumanist vision was J.B.S. Haldane in his book Daedalus. Now, if you're not familiar with the book, again, join the club. But this book was the inspiration for a book that probably most people are familiar with, which is Huxley's book, The Brave New World. And so that idea of the Brave New World really encapsulates what transhumanism is all about. This was an idea that was considered to be a fringe idea. And in the last decade, it's moved from kind of the periphery of the academy into the mainstream of the academy. And it's because we now have the technologies, or at least we're on the cusp of having the technologies, that's going to allow us to pursue and maybe even fulfill the transhumanist vision. So it's an idea that, again, seems like it's the stuff of science fiction, but it really is an idea that is becoming a reality before our very eyes. And I think that there's not going to be an idea that is more important in the next couple of decades than the idea of transhumanism. This is going to be an idea that will shape really the world that we live in over the course of the next couple of decades.
You've mentioned the transhuman vision. Can you define that for me? You said that twice, and I'm not sure our audience would know what that is.
Yeah, well, again, the idea of transhumanism is that we have this obligation to use technology to modify our biological makeup. But the question is, towards what end, right? And that really is the transhumanist vision, is why would we want to do that? And the idea behind transhumanism seems to be very much couched in terms of science and technology. But at the end of the day, it really is a philosophical idea, maybe even a religious idea, because the ultimate goal of transhumanism is not only to mitigate human pain and suffering through the use of technology, but to try to usher in a utopian world. And the idea here is that we turn to science and technology to solve many of the problems that we experience. That the idea of the Enlightenment is that through science and technology, we would become the masters of our own fate. We would become the masters of nature. And transhumanism is looking to become masters of our own bodies, where we would modify our bodies at will to, again, to overcome our limitations, to improve upon, quote unquote, the human condition, and to ultimately overcome the greatest problem that faces any of us, which is our impending death, right? The impending death of humanity, our impending death as individuals. if can we use science and technology to overcome our own mortality? Can we attain a practical immortality through science and technology? And many people see that the only way to do that is to take control of our own evolution and to evolve humanity beyond our current state into these post-human species that would be ideally suited for the world that we would create through science and technology. So it really is very much a religious idea where we're ultimately looking to save ourselves through science and technology.
Okay, so you talk in your book, and by the way, a fantastic book. I really enjoyed it. You talk specifically about techno faith. So as you talk about this religious idea that it's like, so we're trying to save ourselves through technology. It seems like there's an eschatology that we're working toward of achieving utopia, maybe even immortality. How does techno faith play into this, and what do you mean when you use this phrase or this phrase, I guess it would
Yeah,
be.
yeah, and I didn't coin that term. I can't remember where I first heard the term, but it's ultimately the idea that what ultimately is going to save us as human beings is what we can accomplish through our understanding of the world through science and then applying that understanding in developing technology. So it really is, in a sense, a religious system that is fueled by kind of a materialistic, naturalistic, atheistic worldview that that all that is our physical existence. As Carl Sagan said, the universe is all that there was, is, and ever will be. And yet, many people that are transhumanists recognize that there seems to be something tragic about the death of individuals and the potential death of humanity. And so the only way they see for us to save ourselves is through the use of science and technology. Now, from a Christian worldview perspective, science and technology are wonderful tools that we can use, I think, to live out the principles of the kingdom of God, right? That I think
Hmm.
science is a gift that God has given to us that allows us through technology to unleash the providential care that he offers us through the creation. But with transhumanism and with techno faith, you're going to the extreme where science and technology are not simply tools uh, to promote human flourishing, but they are tools that ultimately, as you pointed out, are eschatological in nature, where we're ultimately going to find our salvation.
So the false nature of this gospel is that I mean, no different than any other thing is basically we're going to become gods. We've got the technology to make ourselves into uh, our own little deities that are indestructible,
It's like the
and so
original
that's
sin all over again.
right, right. Well, I was thinking original sin. You're going to be like the gods, Tower of Babel,
Yep.
achieving the heavens, achieving the gods, reaching them on your own. And it's always to circumvent our own need for God. And that's the false nature of it. But a lot of it sounds like it's actually, some of it is beneficial and good. Like, when you think about the idea of prosthetics and people using those as a replacement for an arm, or like I think of Star Wars and, how Luke Skywalker gets his hand chopped off by his by Darth Vader. And for those of you who don't know, it's his dad. I just ruined that one for you. If you haven't seen it by now, shame on you. But he ends up, having a robotic hand. I mean, that seems like a good thing, right? So we
Yeah.
wouldn't necessarily want to stop those kind of things, right?
Yes, yeah, and that's the complexity of the transhumanist vision is that there are these remarkable technologies that are being developed: CRISPR gene editing, brain computer interfaces, robotic prosthetic limbs, um, even advances in anti-aging. There have been some recent scientific reports where people have been able, through the course of a study, to not only arrest the aging process, but actually reverse it so that the test subjects are actually 2 or 3 years biologically younger than their chronological age after being administered different drug cocktails and things like that.
Jeez.
Crazy, crazy stuff. But when you recognize that that aging is actually one of the greatest risks for cardiovascular disease, for diabetes, for cancer, and the list goes on and on and on, that being able to arrest or reverse the aging process makes sense from a biomedical standpoint, because it potentially could revolutionize medicine and really delay the onset of many diseases that, again, are today very much part of the aging process. So these are wonderful possible technologies, but each of these medical technologies has a whole slew of very complex ethical issues connected with them as well. But these same technologies that could be used for enormous amount of good could be used to create designer humans, or to enhance human beings beyond our natural biological limits. Now, is it wrong to enhance human beings beyond our natural biological limits? That's something I still am wrestling with myself. But there seems to be this line that you could cross that where the enhancements go from serving some kind of legitimate purpose to actually really undermining our very nature as human beings.
Give me an example.
Well, one example would be brain-computer interface technology. Now, this is crazy stuff, but there's not an area of bioengineering that's hotter today than developing brain-computer interfaces. But these are literally electronic devices that you either implant in the brain or place on the surface of the brain that allow the user to control with their thoughts computer hardware and computer software. And this is either done through active training, where they learn to manipulate electrical activity in their brain to produce particular outcomes with computer systems, or you have basically these machine learning algorithms that will extract the electrical activity in the brain and interpret what the user intent is. And so using this technology, they've shown that you can actually have somebody think, and that their thoughts can be converted into texts with a high degree of accuracy. Now, this is something that would allow somebody that's locked in, who can't communicate, to be able to communicate with people.
You think like stroke victims?
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
our mentor's wife, Lisa Deer, she had she was in a drug-induced coma for a while, and she's lost the ability to speak. And so for someone like her, this would be a massive step forward to be able to communicate again in the way she used to.
Yes, exactly. So enormous amount of good. But there's interesting things that you can begin to do with brain-computer interfaces, because now you can begin to exert your influence remotely in different parts of the world by coupling, brain-computer interface technology with access to the internet. Or you can begin to do things like potentially tether brains together. There have been interesting studies with.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's
brain
curious.
netting, right?
Yeah. Well,
I got to hear more about this.
Well, there have been interesting studies done with lab animals. Like, you can take two rats, and one rat you train to hit a lever and it'll get a reward, and then the other rat is untrained. And if they both have brain-computer interfaces that are tethered together, the rat and both rats can see each other, and they both have access to those levers, but one rat knows what to do and the other one doesn't. The rat that knows what to do can actually transfer that understanding to the rat that doesn't know what to do. And so by that rat thinking about activating the lever, the other rat will activate the lever, even though it's not trained to do so, and get the reward. And so
This sounds like Star Trek, the Borg.
Oh yeah, crazy.
I mean, that's
stuff.
exactly what it is.
It's crazy stuff.
That is wild.
There's
I remember
ethical implications I want to hear too. Yeah, go ahead.
Well,
Mike,
one example I remember from your book was, it was like a guy was hooked up to a computer in some way. You know the way. I can't remember the way, but anyway, somehow he was hooked up, and he thought about moving like his pointer finger or something. And then some other dude who was wired in had some sort of cap on his head, I think. Like, he involuntarily moved his finger in the way that the guy thought about, so that you could actually send mental signals to other people in other locations via the internet. This is crazy. Is that
so? It's like he's controlling somebody else's finger. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, you could control people. This could get dark.
This is
did I recite that example correctly?
Yes, yeah. You got the concept, and so the point is that once you start looking at potentially tethering brains together, the question becomes, are you losing your identity, as an individual, and who now becomes responsible, for an action that is executed, right? Is it the collective? Is it the individual that carries out that action? And so that's a place where you begin to see, a loss of maybe what it means to be a human being. But something else that's interesting too is there's a new area in bioethics called neuroethics, in terms of how do you actually deal with the ethical questions with these brain-computer interfaces. So even when you're using them for medical application, people are beginning to be concerned. So for example, you can use brain-computer interface technology to control the symptoms of Parkinson's disease, where you send electrical stimulation to certain parts of the brain that help to arrest the Parkinson syndrome symptoms. The problem
is breakthrough.
The problem is that by doing that, you actually alter the personality of the Parkinson's patient, so they become less risk averse, and as a result of that, you then begin to wonder, okay, is the agreement on that part of that patient for subsequent use of that brain-computer interface something they would have normally consented to, apart from having that interface, because again, they become less risk averse. So you're literally are altering their personality. Or if you're using machine learning algorithms to extract user intent from a brain-computer interface, who's actually making the decision to engage in an action? Is it the person? Is it a collaboration between the person and the brain-computer interface, or is it actually the algorithm you develop to extract the user intent? And so these are, and this is with just simple, straightforward medical applications where you're not trying to do anything nefarious, you're trying to help people. But now when you start looking at using this for enhancement purposes, these ethical questions become, even more profound. So are you losing your genuine identity as a human being through the use of this technology? And, so these are the types of this is the place where the line seems to be muddied, right? Where do you cross the line, or should you cross a particular line, and even where is that line to begin with?
Right. It's interesting because it seems like we have this same problem of just like, what is humanity, and at what point do we cross that line on two sides? On one side, it's like, if my brain is hooked up to some other dude or somehow in collaboration with people through electronic signals and I commit a crime, am I accountable? Have I lost my identity? So I can lose my identity that way. But then, and I want to read a quote to you. This is from James Hughes, and you quote this in your book, and he uses this language of post-human, which also sounds like possibly losing your identity, but it starts to come down to the image of God. I'm going to read the quote, and then I'll ask a question kind of along these lines. It says, in the 21st century, the convergence of AI, nanotechnology, genetic engineering will allow human beings to achieve things previously imagined only in science fiction. Lifespans will extend well beyond a century. Our senses, and in your book you say some people think hundreds of years, our senses and cognition will be enhanced. We will gain control over our emotions and memory. We will merge with machines, and machines will become more like humans. These technologies will allow us to evolve into varieties of post-humans, and usher us into a transhuman era and society. So the question I want to ask you is your definition of the image of God, and does what he's describing, or any of the things that we're talking about, whether it be post-human or brains hooking up and someone else controlling, like, are we losing our identity as human beings made in the image of God? And I know that hinges on your definition of being made in the image of God. So if you could talk about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, and I would love to hear your perspective on this because
I like the way you
this is
defined it in the book.
yeah. I mean, this is really where um, things become very, very messy. Now I hold to a resemblance view or a structuralist view of the image of God, where I think the image of God refers to certain attributes or capacities that we have uniquely as human beings that distinguish us or separate us from other creatures. Now, that particular view doesn't necessarily obviate like a representative view or a relational view, because I would argue that the function as God's representatives here on earth would require certain attributes that make us exceptional compared to other creatures. To enter uniquely into a relationship with God, again, would require certain attributes that we would share imperfectly with God. And so I don't think the structuralist view negates the representative view or the relational view, but I think it really is the
Yeah,
perspective that.
and
that
actually, even to back you up just for a second, just for our viewers, could you just real quickly tell us the resemblance view, representative view, and relational view, and then just kind of keep going with that question?
Sure thing. So the resemblance view would be that we have certain attributes that, again, we would share with God that separate us from other creatures. The representative view is that the image of God really refers to our responsibility as human beings, not our innate capacity, and that we are to function as God's vice regent, God's viceroy here
Hmm.
on earth, that we are to be stewards and caretakers of the planet. We are to exercise dominion over the creation. And then the last view would be the relational view, that the image of God is in reference to a unique relationship that we have with God. And again, these three views are not mutually exclusive. They can be, I
Right.
think, fully compatible. And they all three have biblical warrant. They all three have a uh, biblical evidence that supports those views. Uh, but I see the image of God as being, in a sense, immaterial, an immaterial aspect of our nature. And so, in that sense, you could do quite a bit to the human body and not necessarily compromise um,
The Imago
our
Dei.
the imago Dei, right? And so, in one sense, you could argue that no matter what we do to ourselves as human beings, we ultimately are going to be, again, retain the image of God. However, I would argue that, you know, and again, you guys are the theologians. I'm just a biochemist here, but
We play at theology, we should say. We just play. We're not
We
theologians.
just play.
well, but for example, my understanding is that really, as human beings, we're not ghosts in the machine. But in other words, it's not the image of God or an immaterial aspect to our nature or soul kind of bouncing around inside a container, but rather our spiritual and physical aspects are integrated. They're inseparable in that sense. To be fully human would be to be both physical as well as spiritual in nature, which means that there is an interplay between the image of God and between our physical makeup. And so I always see the brain as being kind of like the hardware and the image of God being like the software. And if the hardware becomes damaged, right, that it may be very challenging to properly express the image of God, but it doesn't mean the image of God isn't there.
Hmm.
It just means that because the hardware isn't working right, the image of God isn't fully and appropriately expressed. So, if you start talking about in that model, if you start talking about, manipulating our mental our brains with a brain computer interface technology, if you start tethering brains together, it may be that you alter the brain in such a way that the image of God, though it's still present, may not be properly expressed. So
We would
those are
say
just
that's
some
true
thoughts.
Okay.
now,
Yeah.
wouldn't we?
Miller, I just wanted to say on the front end, whenever this stuff develops, the answer in advance to whether or not you can tether your brain to mine is no. I'm not going to let it happen.
Nah, you'll change your mind. Trust me. Or I'll tether it and change it for you.
So you can be the eye candy, and then your brain is tethered to mine. So
I'll
I'm the
take a few
mind.
leaps in my human evolution just by being brain tethered to Rowntree. I was going to say, this is already true. We would say that we are the Imago Dei still. We're still the image of God, but our bodies have been affected by the fall.
Yeah.
My hair is getting grayer and grayer. I have a
Amen.
hiatal hernia. I mean, already the structural nature of who I am has been marred, but it has not taken away the image of God. You would agree with that on the front end, right?
Yes, I would. Yeah, and that's actually a very helpful insight. Um, you know, um, and also when you factor in the idea of our sin nature, we do bear the image of God, but the image of God, because of our sin nature, is again not being expressed the way that God originally intended at the point of creation. And so when we accept Christ into our heart and we start to undergo this transformation to become more and more like Christ, we really are becoming more and more capable of expressing the image of God as God intended it to be expressed. And so we are in a process of recovering, that true image of God, through the process of sanctification. So that's a helpful concept, I think, to bring to bear, when we talk about, can we modify ourselves to such a degree that we lose the image of God? I
Well,
tend to think the
how
answer
does
is no.
medication fit into this? Because we
Well,
modify our chemistry. I took an antibiotic because I had strep throat. Did I modify? And also, some medicines we take do alter our
right,
personality. I mean, you think about an antidepressant
right,
or certain drugs that would actually cause a person to have more anxiety or
right,
less anxiety. I mean,
right.
we're tampering with this stuff all the time.
Yeah, and I see that as that we are affecting brain chemistry, and the brain is, again, in this crude analogy of hardware and software. The brain is the hardware, so we're modifying the hardware, but it doesn't mean that we are actually, altering, the image of God in any way by doing that. We may make it easier or more difficult or more challenging, for the image of God to be expressed. For
Mm.
one criticism against the structuralist view or the resemblance view is, well, what about people, for example, with Down syndrome? Do they lack the image of God, or does somebody who doesn't suffer from Down syndrome, do they have the image of God to a greater degree than somebody who again suffers from some kind of mental limitation? And my answer is no. It's just simply the issue that there's a problem with the hardware, but that the image of God is still present. So I would see the use of antidepressants, for example, in that capacity where depression or other types of mental illness, really represent um, you know um, uh, abnormal brain chemistry that can maybe be corrected or mitigated to some degree with medication. So I don't see that as altering the image of God. But again, there's this interplay between the physical and the immaterial, and you know, um, you do see people that have personality changes as a result of a stroke or things like that. So it's not a nice clean division, I guess.
Right. Okay. Now, on a specific technology, talk to us about CRISPR gene editing. Just
Yeah.
what it is, how it can be used for good, for ill, and I'd love to think like on the ill side, possibly. You've touched a little bit on evolving ourselves or evolution, and one of the quotes earlier touched on that as well, especially as we talk about post-humans. What was unique to me and I kind of eye-opening as I was reading your book, I was just thinking about, if I dyed my hair blonde or I put in green contacts, so my eyes change to green instead of blue. These would be things like if I had babies, it's not like my babies would have that in the genetic pool because it was just something external. But if I edit my genes, however I edit my genes, it enters into the gene pool and then becomes part of the human evolution. So just talk to us about CRISPR and its role in that, and maybe you could wax philosophical for us on the end.
Yeah. And CRISPR is one of these transformative technologies. It's essentially a gene editing technique that allows researchers with very high precision to go in and to modify the genome of an organism, to modify the DNA of an organism. And so you can think of CRISPR as being like a pair of scissors where you can, again, cut away pieces of the DNA. And in some instances, you're just simply, deleting pieces of the genome. Other instances, you're cutting away pieces of the genome. And then through a number of different types of manipulations, you can actually introduce a piece of donor DNA that would be incorporated into the genome at the region where you actually spliced out or cut out that particular piece of DNA. And so it's a very high precision gene editing technique that allows us to target specific changes in the genome. Now, where this becomes extremely useful from a biomedical standpoint is that we know of probably somewhere between 5 to 10,000 genetic disorders that involve mutations to a single region of the genome. And so in principle, you could then go in and replace the defective region of the genome with a healthy version of the genome. So let me give a concrete example. Cystic fibrosis is a disease that is caused by a mutation, a single base pair change in the gene that codes for something called a chloride transporter. This is a protein embedded in the cell membrane that moves chloride ions across the membrane. And when you have cystic fibrosis, that mutation in that single gene actually causes people to suffer from breathing problems, where you have all this fluid and stuff that begins to accumulate, and mucus that begins to accumulate in the lungs. And the prognosis isn't good for someone with cystic fibrosis. Even though the medical treatment has improved dramatically, there's no way to cure that disease. So the idea is that if you could use CRISPR and you could replace that defective gene with a healthy version of the gene, you could actually maybe mitigate the symptoms of cystic fibrosis, maybe even, I don't think you could potentially cure the people of the disease, but you could at least eliminate or mitigate the symptoms. So the idea is that you would develop some kind of aerosol that people could take that would introduce the gene editing package into the lung cells. And even if a 10 or 20% of those lung cells were successfully gene edited, that would make a dramatic improvement in the person suffering from cystic fibrosis. Now, to your point, Michael, that would not be actually a genetic change that would be passed on to the next generation, because you're only modifying the cells in the genome of the cells in the lungs. But if you actually modify the cells, the gametes, the sex cells, or if you do the gene editing during the process of embryo formation, like in vitro fertilization, now you would actually introduce genes into that
genome,
organism.
the human pool of
right, and
genetic
that would then
makeup.
Right,
that's
and
a permanent alteration for generations to come.
Right. And so many people that are working on CRISPR gene editing of humans for clinical purposes have a very strong opposition to actually doing gene editing at the embryo stage. Now,
you could kill out the human race. You could edit their genes to where they can't procreate. I mean, that could be used in chemical warfare, right? There's negative impacts negative potential impacts of these things as well.
Right. Well, I think you guys may remember a few years ago, there was a scientist in China that actually did CRISPR gene editing on human embryos. and he essentially disabled a particular protein that serves as the binding site for the HIV virus. And as a result, those embryos and the individuals that would develop from those embryos would be resistant to AIDS, would be resistant to HIV. Now, most people that have done those kind of experiments have stopped at they basically will kill the embryos after a couple of weeks. He went ahead and implanted those embryos into surrogates, and the claim was that there were births that were involved. Now he crossed the line and there was a universal outcry against what he had done. Although there were some scientists who said, "Look, he just simply jumped the gun. This is invariably where we're headed with this kind of technology." And so this is where you could actually then do gene editing in such a way that you could evolve human beings into post-human species, where you could create designer babies and go even one step further and now create human beings that have been modified to such a degree that they would really move beyond what it means to be a human.
I'm curious what the outcry was, and not that it would surprise me at all. I can fathom a few ideas, but what was the basic outcry when that happened? Why were people saying this is absolutely not okay?
It wasn't so much on the basis of morality; it was more on the basis of safety. That we don't know what the effects are going to be, for those children, and now you're potentially introducing genes into the human gene pool that are non-natural. That was essentially the nature of the outcry. It wasn't that that this procedure essentially involves the manipulations and the selection and destruction of human embryos, which to me as a Christian who holds
Right.
to a pro-life position, I would find absolutely repugnant.
Yeah.
But it was more, we're not really quite ready for this, and you jump the gun, right? But
Yeah.
again, it was nearly a universal outcry, but there were a few people who said, "Look, you're being hard on this guy, but he's just simply going where we ultimately want to go." So there were a few honest people, I think, that really recognized, where this technology is ultimately headed.
Yeah, I remember there was one guy you talked about who oversees a major CRISPR, like they sell CRISPR kits for like as little as $5 or something. Like you edit your own
Yeah,
genes, and
yeah,
one of the sayings is, these days people get drunk and get tattoos, but one day they're gonna say, "Well, I got drunk and CRISPR'd myself."
Oh,
Um,
no.
didn't he stood in front of a crowd of people and edited his own genes? Right? Who am I
yeah.
talking about here?
The guy's name is Josiah Zahner, and he's a biochemist. He's used to work at NASA, so he's a highly credible, well trained scientist. But he's pioneering this DIY movement, this biology DIY movement, which is really very frightening, because the whole idea here is that, look, this is such a powerful transformative technology that it needs to be democratized. It shouldn't just simply be in the hands of the biomedical and the scientific elite. That everybody should have access to this technology, and we should be able to use it any way that we want. Well, not to sound elitist, but it's really a good thing that the scientific elite and the biomedical elites are actually utilizing or are in control of the technology, because even though we all have concerns about the types of decision making that they may engage in, and whether or not something they do lacks wisdom, they at least have enough of an understanding of the technology to not do things that are totally flagrant. But to have the technology in the hands of people that are untrained is really very frightening. And here's the
Yeah.
problem with CRISPR: is it's such a powerful technology that is incredibly cheap and very easy to use. And so, as you're pointing out, Michael, you can go on Amazon and order a CRISPR gene editing kit, and if you have,
I think you just
same
sold a
day,
few.
yeah,
Wait, so this is actually available? Are you saying that like
yeah,
people could literally go on Amazon right now and do this?
yeah. So if you've got Amazon Prime and you get same day delivery, you could order it in the morning, and by that afternoon you could be doing a CRISPR gene editing, experiment on your kitchen counter. Now, the stuff that they sell on Amazon is rather benign. It's just kind of a novelty, but people like Josiah Zahner are selling gene editing kits for several $1,000s, which still is relatively cheap in terms of a scientific technology that actually can do much more impressive things. Or who's to
Such
stop?
as what? What's
Well,
out there
I
right
mean,
now?
what he did is he actually gene edited himself with a gene called uh, that it was with a gene editing package that disables a gene called myostatin. And myostatin codes for a protein that kind of regulates muscle growth.
Yeah.
And so when you disable that, you wind up having muscle growth that becomes uncontrolled. And so Chinese scientists did an experiment where they uh, disabled the myostatin gene in a particular dog breed. And when you look at that dog breed, it really looks like,
It's
this.
ripped.
It's ripped. It's very grotesque. But and so people are looking at using that technology. I mean, so
I'm just imagining like the advertisements for that. Would you like your dog to squat 400 pounds? Yes.
well, well, the thing is that for somebody, let's say if you're suffering from a muscle wasting disease, that kind of gene
Like
editing could,
MS.
yeah, right, that kind of technology could actually help reverse the symptoms and improve the quality of life for people. But if you're just giving that to a normal, healthy individual, and you could easily see athletes being swayed into doing this, you now suddenly
It's the new
become,
steroid.
yeah, you become superhuman in strength. And there's a biotech company in Argentina that's looking at developing these super racehorses using that very
It
technology.
changes everything. It doesn't make it fun anymore. I mean, there's no more debates over Michael Jordan versus LeBron because now you have like a 9'3" dude who can jump crazy high, and I
That's part of the
mean,
reason the
you start
steroids were
affecting
outlawed.
everything. Yeah.
Yeah, they
Okay,
took
Miller. I
steroids
thought.
out of the Olympics for that reason.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Hey, we have some chatter in the chat, which is where the chatter comes, about the mark of the beast. We can't talk transhumanism without talking about the mark of the beast. Now, theologically speaking, I'm not even going to ask your opinion. Um, I I'm going to ask it because it's really those who come from the dispensational school of thought for the most part who are going to say, well, hey, when Revelation 13 talks about the mark of the beast, this is a physical, maybe could be microchip. At least that was kind of like the old school view, and it kind of keeps getting upgraded with different versions of technology. But basically, you can't buy and sell except if you have this mark on the back of your right hand or on your forehead. Given the technologies that we're talking about, it seems like that's already possible. That's been possible for a long time. But could you talk through just if let's assume for a moment you held to like a physical mark of the beast, that was your interpretation. How would transhumanism fit into that sort of conversation?
Yeah, for example, and gosh, I'm not a conspiracy theorist by any means when it comes to this type of stuff, but one of the ideas that Bill Gates has advocated is to use the use of what are called quantum dots that would be incorporated into vaccines. And so the idea is that when you receive a vaccine, these these quantum dots would be these particles essentially would be essentially uh, introduced into your body just beneath the skin, and that they would contain a record that could be read as to what vaccines that you had received and when you received those vaccines. So it becomes a
Mm.
way in which your vaccination record becomes a permanent part of your biological makeup. And so you could
Ooh.
begin to see that, that kind of technology really being used to label
So then you
people.
can't buy, sell, trade because your Vax
Right.
Tracks shows you that you haven't been vaccinated.
Right. And so you could easily begin to see how that kind of a technology could be used as, essentially the mark of the beast. But, in terms, we've talked a little bit about the idea that transhumanism is a false gospel, and it's going to become a very appealing gospel, in the years to come, right? As we become more and more secular, as people become to rely more and more on science to solve our problems, our ultimate problem is, again, our immortality. And so could we attain, a practical immortality? But you could begin to see a world where the expectation is that that you do undergo certain types of gene editing. You could even easily see a scenario where, you would have to be genetically fingerprinted, your genome sequenced. And if you and your spouse, have, or your partner have genes that would make your offspring susceptible to certain genetic disorders, that in order to have a child, you have to submit yourself to, kind of a gene editing protocol where the embryos that you produce in vitro would undergo gene editing to eliminate that particular genetic disorder. And if you don't, then no longer, that your child isn't going to be eligible for medical care because you've willingly gave birth to a child that has a genetic defect. So you could begin to see kind of a high-tech type of eugenics. Or if you don't agree to certain genetic modifications, that again, you are going to be labeled as an outcast of sorts. You're going to be marginalized, and that you could again keep track of the kind of genetic modifications through, things like quantum dot technology. So I could easily see, this leading us towards kind of a one world order where you could see people being pressured into accepting the transhumanist and human enhancement technologies, whether they want to or not, that they're kind of forced into that. So that easily leads you to a number of scenarios that I think fit with the biblical perspective on end times, right?
Yeah. Okay. Miller, what? Okay. You don't look like you have a question. Josh does that to me all the time.
I don't. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it is. Well,
I'm just not awkwarded out by it.
Well, I want to come to just to another question as we're kind of jumping on different ways in which transhumanism, it encroaches on image of God, Christian view of salvation, Christian view of eschatology. Let's talk about the Christian view of death, the transhumanistic view of death. Because if we're talking about, okay, so people living well over 100 being the norm, according to the one quote that I read, and then others saying hundreds of years. I mean, that sounds unfathomable. This is like Bible times. We're going back to the early days. In fact, there's like a Methuselah, what's it called? Some sort of organization that has Methuselah in the name.
No way.
Yeah, there is. So talk to us about some of this anti-aging technology in the context of two views of death, the Christian view and the transhumanistic view.
Like Benjamin Button.
Yeah. Well, it's, and the organization is called the Methuselah Foundation, and it's headed up by a biogerontologist by the name of Aubrey de Grey, who is a highly credible, life scientist who is advocating for essentially anti-aging technology, where he believes that we could very easily extend human life expectancy into the range of several hundreds of years. And of course, that kind of wide-scale application of anti-aging technology would literally change the nature of the world that we live in, and not necessarily for the best. But if you have a materialistic, atheistic view of human nature, then when you die. That's it. And so you want to do everything you can to extend life expectancy, with the idea that longer life expectancy would also come along with a high quality of life. That becomes an overarching motivation, but it really does lead to a very selfish world where your concern is essentially, what can I do to stay alive? What can I do to to retain, my quality of life as long as I possibly can. And that's very different because throughout human history, we always have looked at, our legacy as being really something that our children and grandchildren would carry with us, and that we recognize that the next generation is very important. And even if you don't have kids, you're willing to invest your life to make sure that the lives of the next generation are better, that they have every advantage that they can have. And that leads to a very selfless world, or a much more selfless world, where you're interested in what can I do for those people that come after me? How can I help those people?
Yeah.
And that spreads over to being willing to help other people in a world where anti-aging technology becomes the norm. There's going to be an inherent conflict between generations, where the new generation is going to see the current generation as being in the way, and the current generation is going to see the new generation as being a threat. And so I think it's going to fundamentally change the world that we live in. But from a Christian perspective, we recognize that our life has ultimate meaning because there is a finite nature to it, and that there's an urgency to what we do as we live. If you could live for as long as you could possibly imagine, it would take a lot of the meaning out of life. It would take a lot of the urgency out of life. And so you're willing to live, and to try to live to its fullest extent, because you recognize your lifetime is finite, that you're willing to invest in other people, because you want to establish a legacy that is really in the hands of those people that follow after you.
Yeah.
And ultimately you're willing to live a life of finite duration, because you recognize that what is to come beyond this lifetime is really the ultimate goal. That that eternal life is what is awaiting us, and that the lifetime that we live here is meant to accomplish certain things, namely, to glorify God, to share the love of God with others, hopefully introduce people to a relationship with God through the person of Christ, through the gospel. That becomes our purpose from a Christian perspective, where we want to do that and do that well. But we realize that we have an assignment while we're here, but this isn't the entire story. And this is, I think, what's completely lost with transhumanism. But this is where I think the gospel has enormous amount of power, ironically, in a world that's going to be shaped by transhumanism, because the obsession now becomes with salvation. How do we save ourselves? How do we attain eternal life? And I think it's very easy to show that technology and science can never truly save us, that that techno-faith is ultimately a false gospel. And this is where we can present the gospel, where the gospel suddenly takes on relevance in a very exciting and a very fresh way. Because if transhumanists are ultimately guilty of seeking after salvation in the wrong places, but they recognize that death isn't natural, that there's something tragic when an individual dies. There's something tragic in thinking about the demise of human beings as a species. That the world isn't the way that it's supposed to be, and that we need to do what we can to mitigate pain and suffering, to try to create a utopian world. These are really wonderful ideals, and there's nothing wrong with turning to science and technology as a tool to help us, at least, while we are here on Earth, to promote human flourishing, to mitigate suffering wherever we can. But we ultimately recognize that true salvation is found in the person of Christ, not in what technology can bring to bear. And this is where I think there are some interesting bridge points between Christianity and transhumanism that really make the gospel relevant in a powerful way.
Yeah. Okay. Love that. Well, we're getting to that point of the show where we need to kind of tie things up. And so Fuzz, love for you to maybe think about a closing thought, how you'd summarize, or just any closing thought you'd like to leave people with. And then Michael Miller, I'll have Michael go first, Fuzz, so that you have a chance to kind of think of what you want to say. Michael's a little more used to this. So, Michael, what would be your summarizing thought, or just what you would like people to walk away with?
Well, it does seem like the transhuman vision is anti-gospel. I don't think those two things, at least the transhuman vision, I don't think that's reconcilable with the gospel. I think the very idea that we try to save ourselves um, is just the opposite of humility. I mean, the whole point of coming to Christ is our recognition of our need for Him. Um, and so I would say it's counter gospel. And it's something that you mentioned at the very end of that about how we think of the next generation. I think of the passage of scripture in the Proverbs says, a man who doesn't leave an inheritance for his sons is worse than the pagans. And that there's a sense in which we cannot experience God-like love until we love something more than ourselves. And the transhuman gospel, so to speak, does just the opposite. It's all about you becoming your most fulfilled self rather than
Yeah.
becoming about others. And so it's definitely antithetical to that, at least its vision and its agenda.
Yeah.
Yes, I would leave with that.
Awesome. Okay, Fuzz, what about you? What would be your closing thought?
Yeah, and I would actually agree with Michael's points. And to me, I do see transhumanism as one of the most influential ideas that is going to be with us in the next couple of decades. A lot of people will be persuaded by the false gospel of transhumanism. But I do think one of the things that transhumanism does that's very interesting is it really exposes the human need to connect with that which is transcendent. It really exposes the human need for hope, purpose, and destiny. And so this is what I think we need to really work on in terms of capitalizing it. But I think as Christians, we have to be aware of what transhumanism is about. We have to be willing to engage this idea and to do it with an element of sophistication. And again, I think it gives us an opportunity to really present the gospel to people in our culture in a way in which they are going to be probably much more oriented towards hearing the gospel. I work for a science faith organization, and part of our challenge is to challenge the notion that science makes belief in God irrelevant, that science becomes a barrier to the gospel. And what I see with transhumanism is the opposite, is that transhumanism is really laying bare the need that we all have in what the gospel ultimately offers us.
Amen. Well,
Yeah, exposes.
yeah, totally, and totally agree with those, with everything that you guys said. And Fuzz, I love the way in your book you say, hey, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's good, there's bad. And you really give us the tools to sort through that. So I encourage you guys, if you're interested in this subject, buy his book, Humans 2.0. And so, yeah, fantastic read. Fuzz, it is a pleasure to have you on the show. Dr. Fazale Rana, for those who want the full name. And love to have you back on sometime. Maybe we can chat about the historical Adam, some of the things that you've studied. So everybody, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you. Of course, on Tuesdays, we're releasing those short clips from our conference in November with theologians from all over the world. And then on Wednesday, we're gonna be back. It's gonna be me and Michael. Josh will still be on the cruise, but man, it's gonna be an exciting show talking through more prophecy reviews, and these ones from Destiny's Image. And so we keep getting all these requests: review the prophecies. So we're what the Scripture says, 1 Timothy 5. To test prophecy. So we're going to obey that scripture and do that. You guys, if you enjoyed the show, hit the like button, hit the share button, and possibly hit the donate button. PayPal for a one-time, Patreon for a recurring donation. Thank you guys so much for joining us. God bless you all, and have a great week.